Are you looking for art tips to turn your art from rinky-dinky to professional?
Oh golly, I am.
Well, you're in luck, because here on the Paint That Bell channel, we plan on giving that to you with no cost whatsoever. Free? Yes, free. All that we ask in return is that you may be subscribed so that you never miss another installment of these imaginative installments. Today's lavishing lesson is how to draw in inks.
First off, what we need is the proper materials. Line art can be either inks or digital, but for this video we'll be more specific on traditional, but the tips and tricks can be applied to either traditional or digital. That being said, here's what you need. Paper, preferably rough, but plain old printer sheet paper can work too, just be careful with it. A sketch, I mean, come on, we're not going in without one. Pens, I would suggest the absolute traditional way with brushes if you're familiar with it, but I'm not familiar with it, so let's stick with pens for this one, okay? Cheap pens can work, but for the artwork I'll be using Micron and some other brand that I forgot, cause the name rubbed off. So we have our materials, let's move on to the tips on how to improve. Okay, so the key to awesomeness when it comes to line art is your line confidence, line thickness, patience, and your techniques. First off, we have line confidence. What is line confidence? Well, to put it bluntly, it's the smoothness of your lines. Where this comes from is how confident you are in carrying out those smooth lines. When you're not confident in your line art, what can happen is you get these very hairy lines, or lack of a better term. They become very scratchy and they don't have the smoothness that you really desire. How do you fix this? Well, for starters, what you can do instead of his back and forth motions and these multiple line motions, instead what you should do is do one singular smooth line. Not throughout the whole thing, but more than that than anything else. One tip is that for very long lines, use your elbow and not your wrist. Even use your whole arm even. When you use your wrist, you limit your range of motion and how far your smooth lines can get. When it needs to be longer, depending on circumstances. It takes time to get to this point where you can be confident enough to do it. So it does take a lot of practice to get to this point. Secondly, line thickness. Line thickness is what it appears to be. Not everybody applies line thickness to their drawings. It's helpful, but not necessary. That being said, I'm putting it anyway, just in case you wanted to try it out. So, how thick are your lines and how are you doing it? There are a few places to use line thickness and how much. Be sure to vary your line thickness when there are more shadows or less shadows in effect of the artwork, when drawing details versus drawing the outline. When conveying speed and perspective, try to taper off your line thickness in some areas if it calls for it, and intersecting lines should make thicker lines. For varying your line thickness for shadows, what you probably need to take into effect is your light source. If you know your light source well enough, then you should apply more line thickness in the shadowy areas. For example, what I did to the ball. Even if there's no color, you can tell where the light is coming from and how strong it is. Now, when drawing details, make sure that the details are thinner than your outlines. Outlines are the outer parts where nothing else is drawn outside of it. The details are for the face and the like. When conveying speed and perspective, you want to use thinner lines for things that are farthest away and thicker lines for things that are closer. So if someone is running, for example, then what is farther away from us should have thinner lines. Here are some examples. Now, when there are nice long thick lines that you've used but don't connect up to anything, just taper them off. What do I mean by that? Well, what it means is going from thick to thin. It looks rather abrupt to just end thick lines with nothing underneath it, so sometimes it's better to just taper them off. Something like this. Finally, when lines intersect, it looks really good to add more line variation there. For example, like what we have here. When there's no intersection, it tends to look, well, kinda boring. But with intersection, it really gives it life and weight to the object in question. Next thing to improve on? Patience. When it comes to drawing traditionally with inks, it takes a lot of patience. Digital artists really have it easy with the Ctrl-Z option, but with inks, usually you don't have an option of getting rid of mistakes. I mean, there's whiteout, but if you go back and try and fix that mistake, it won't look just right. So you have to be really slow sometimes when it comes to inks, especially when it comes to brushes and dips. With pens, the control is a lot easier, but it still takes time. So be sure to have plenty of patience when you're drawing in traditional inks. Finally, the last thing that you will have to improve on is your techniques, which deserves a transition and discussion in of itself. There are so many techniques to cover, so that's why this gets its own transition. Now that we talked about the basics, now we get to talk about the techniques used. The thing with techniques is that it's very specific to a style. Some people use it for specific things and others use it for other reasons. There is no right or wrong here. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll talk about what I use, why I use it, how I use it, and what the technique is. So the techniques we have are hatching, cross-hatching, contour, and cross-contour. Plus one I don't know the name of, but I tend to call it blocking. I've provided some examples for you so that it's easier to visualize what I'm talking about. With hatching, it's done with straight lines. Now for hatching, the reason I use it is because it adds more depth to the character. It adds shading without really needing to go full heavy with the blocking. More on blocking in a minute. Hatching is what I use when I don't cross-hatch. Hatching is very straight and doesn't cross each other like with cross-hatching. Cross-hatching is probably what I use the most for shadows. It's like hatching, but you add more layers of differing angles on top of it. It's practically the same as hatching, but with cross-hatching, I use it more for shadows, and then from there on out, I hatch to create the illusion of tapering and the shadows coming more into the light. With contour and cross-contour, it's pretty much hatching and cross-hatching with a few minor differences. They follow the form. Hatching and cross-hatching are more straight lines. Contour and cross-contour is more curved. Following the form of the object in question that you're drawing, that's cross-contour and contour. I use this technique for rounder objects and more flesh-like objects. Not always, but usually. Lastly, blocking. I don't know if that's the proper name for this technique, but it's what I'm going with for the video. Blocking, I use a lot. It's when I basically put in solid blocks of ink. Sounds simple enough, but I use it in specific ways for a specific effect. Anyone can use blocking, but if used incorrectly, your artwork might portray a certain mood that you weren't aiming for, or it can really confuse the viewers on where your light source is. So with blocking, what I do is follow the form and use it in areas where there is a lot of shadow. Typically under the head where the chin rests is where I typically block, to give you an idea. Now, it's important to know your light source when it comes to blocking. Knowing how strong it is and which direction it's coming from shows how much blocking to use and where. Now, I use blocking a lot mostly for the mood. When I want a more grim, serious, gritty, emotional feel, I will use more blocking as it portrays more shadows. Shadows can be very moody, so that's why I say be careful on how you use the technique blocking. For lighter moods, you may want to use blocking less unless you have a hidden agenda. Now that that's all out of the way, I think we need a drawing session where we bring it all together. Go ahead and bring out your materials, get your sketches ready, and begin to ink. But if you don't want to do that, then I already have a speed paint here ready for you to go. It can also be used for educational purposes, I suppose, if you want to see how all that we talked about here today can come together. That being said, y'all ready? You can pause if you need to grab stuff. Okay, ready now? Let's get into it. Alright, now that the speed paint is over, I just want to show y'all where we used what we talked about above in our pieces. As you can see, I use a lot of hatching and cross hatching throughout the whole piece, as it really adds depth and the light. I also use cross contour and contour along the dumbbells, as it creates a more rounder shape, and I use a lot of blocking around the pants, as it really portrays a lot there. Also, it's skin tight, so another thing I forgot to mention is that blocking can be used stylistically to portray different types of fabrics. That is very much a stylistic choice, so you can ignore the pants if you choose to. But you can see in other places where I've used blocking around the neck. That being said, that was our piece. If you want to show me yours, you can go ahead and tag me on Instagram and DeviantArt. I'd really love to see how this tutorial helped you and your friends, and we can just grow together as a community. That'd be great. Now, before we finish off the video, here are my final tips and tricks. Be careful of smudging. Some brands of pens have different inks that take longer to dry, so it's best to avoid rubbing on any wet inks if you can help it. It stains really bad and it ruins the artwork that you worked so hard on. And on the topic of smudging, try to wear clothing that won't get in the way and you aren't afraid of staining. If you're working with brush and inks, it's definitely important to wear clothes you don't want to get dirty and won't get in the way. But even then, you never know, accidents can happen with other forms of inking, so it's better to be safe than sorry. Wear an apron if you're very concerned. Now, don't be afraid to use water. When your ink is fresh and wet, you can use water to move it around and give it a sort of watercolor feel that will bring your inked drawings to life. That being said, it's not easy to control. It's like watercolor, and like watercolor, it's not easy to control, but is easier the less water you use. So be careful with how much water you use. Finally, don't be afraid to read up more techniques than what I listed if you're interested, or to go in more into depth of what I said and talked about. But go ahead and learn more that you can. It'll probably be fun. The video is coming to an end. Thank you for watching. We hope it helped you. Like and share with your friends if you think it'll be helpful. And as always, stay artsy, my crazy creatives, and I'll see y'all later.